All right, so welcome everybody. This is the first of our speaker series for 2011 from the Center for Criminological Research. I am Jeff Broussard, and I'm very pleased to now introduce Marta Urbanik in just a moment. She'll be giving the talk, Notorious Police Officers and Cop Clocking in the Inner City. Before we do that, though, I just wanted to mention very quickly our next talk that'll be coming up in the series. So on February 26th, Dr. Katrina Mayer from University of Guelph will be giving a talk entitled "It's Just Such a Different Drug, Police Narratives of Meth, Crime, and Punishment in a Time of Crisis." All right, so I'm just gonna switch over to Marta's slides in a second here. But before I do that, let's see if I can, this is gonna take me a quarter second here. I just want to introduce Marta. So Marta is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology here at the University of Alberta. She's an urban ethnographer specializing in gangs and neighborhood redevelopment in the Canadian context. And her research interests include issues pertaining to gangs and gang violence in neighborhoods and in prison, the effects of neighborhood redevelopment on criminal processes, neighborhood beefs and beefs in quotation marks, and violence, the street code on social media, police minority relations, and research methods. All right, so here I am going to pop up Marta's slides. If I can find all the things. Zoom is not being our friend today. So I have too many windows open. There's the controls, and I'll share the screen on this. All right, so we should have Marta's slides up. So Marta, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. Okay, so hi everyone. Happy Friday. Thank you for being here today. I'd like to thank all of my colleagues at the CCR and of course, Jeff for setting this up and inviting me to talk with you about some of my work. Now, of course, as is standard with COVID, we are having some tech issues despite multiple successful trial runs. Jeff has been kind enough, and so he's going to be doing the manual slide changing. What I want to do today is I want to present a paper recently published in the British Journal of Criminology with some of my colleagues, with Dr. Carolyn Green from Athabasca and Jake Vojnadovich, who's one of my master's students. Now, this paper examines how marginalized residents in Toronto's inner city perceive and navigate police in their neighborhoods. And it's going to have a particular focus on officers that they perceive as being crooked, corrupt, or notorious. Jeff, slide please. Now, we know that the police have really proliferated many marginalized and racialized inner city neighborhoods across North America since about the 1990s. This is quite well established in the literature and has resulted in expansive scholarly activists and, of course, resident criticisms about the harms of overpolicing and hypersurveillance. This is particularly true for many communities where we have higher proportions of Black residents and residents of color. Now, undoubtedly, the Black Lives Matter movement has again brought the issue of racial injustices in policing to the fore of public consciousness. It's drawn wider societal attention to the prevalence of things like police violence, police misconduct, and of course, use of lethal force. Now, this is also true in Toronto, where our study is based and where thousands have protested against these police behaviors in recent years. Toronto is also a little bit of an epicenter for potentially a crisis in police legitimacy, which is how it has been referred to by residents and certainly by some police officials as well. And this is particularly true for some of Toronto's most vulnerable communities. Jeff, if you could hit the slide, please. Now, we see this even being acknowledged by some of the city's top officials. For example, Toronto's former deputy police chief, Pete Slowly, said he had never seen policing at this low a point in terms of the public's trust and police legitimacy. And even Toronto's mayor, has spoken about the unacceptable level of distrust between the Toronto Police Service and residents of some of Toronto's more marginalized communities. If you could hit the slide, please. Thanks. Now, if you're familiar with the scholarship on inner city policing, you know that a lot of these issues have been widely documented. We've seen many scholars document widespread police harassment, unwarranted police stops, verbal abuse, use of excessive force, and a lot of this has been particularly against racialized men. As a result, we know that many inner city residents across the United States, but also in Canada, often distrust and even fear the police. And in light of this policing milieu and recognizing the risks that may come with interacting with police officers, many inner city residents, especially those who are racialized, have had to adapt. And so we see that residents have developed strategies to first limit their encounters with the police, and second, to try to mitigate any consequences of potential interactions. Now, one recent study examined this in greater depth. This is, of course, Forrest Stewart's work, how he examined Los Angeles Skid Row residents. And he really presented us with this concept of cop wisdom, right? That's this interpretive schema where residents attempt to make seemingly random police behaviors more legible, predictable, and manipulable. And through this, of course, the goal is to evade police, right? Deflect their intentions and kind of really flip them on their head. And what Forrest found is that police behaviors in Skid Row were not random. They could be studied, and this information could be used strategically by residents to try to avoid police. And with this information, residents could modify their behaviors and appearance to really try to protect themselves from anything they perceived as police harassment or police abuses. Now, a lot of the existing literature on inner city policing provides us with a really rich understanding of how inner city residents make sense of, navigate, and attempt to limit police encounters. We've really learned quite a bit about this. Can you hit the slide, please? However, a lot of the work to date has tended to focus on policing as an institution, right? It has examined how individuals behave when it comes to the police, looking at it as a monolith and not really examining whether there might be differences between officers. Next slide, please. Now, the tendency of the literature to really homogenize citizens' perceptions of and interactions with police is surprising for two reasons. First and foremost, of course, law enforcement personnel represent the institution of policing, and they might reflect and fall into broader police culture. However, we also know that police officers operate as distinct individuals. There's various factors and backgrounds that influence their behaviors, motivations, and citizen interactions. The second thing is that we know that existing literature actually suggests, if you look carefully enough, that citizens actively differentiate between officers. For example, there's numerous works documenting the existence of officers who might be considered quote unquote notorious or problematic across marginalized neighborhoods in the United States. We also know that certain scholars have uncovered that specific officers can affect how community members interact with those officers and the neighborhood more broadly. And there are quite a few notable mentions of residents having problems with specific police officers. And so the literature to date has definitely suggested that residents differentiate between police officers for good reasons and also for bad reasons. However, this differentiation has really only been briefly discussed. It's been like a really cursory thought, usually only dedicated in a couple of sentences, or even on the slide, if you can see, in a couple of footnotes. So you have to look really, really hard to locate this differentiation in full books examining inner city policing. So while we know that this happens and that this can happen in neighborhoods across the United States, we know very little else. And so this is the topic that our paper really pursues, this micro process of officer differentiation in the inner city. Jeff, can you hit the slide, please? So the study that I'm going to talk to you about today is part of a much larger piece of work, which started in 2016. This project is exploring perceptions of and interactions with police in 3 Toronto inner city neighborhoods. So this includes Regent Park, St. Jamestown, and Blake Boltby. And the larger study examines multiple facets of policing. But this paper specifically draws upon a subset of 40 interviews and 8 follow-up interviews conducted with 26 men and 14 women who lived in or had deep connections to either Regent Park or St. Jamestown. Now, these 2 neighborhoods are policed by the same division. We recruited participants through our existing networks in these communities. So for myself, that includes 8 years worth of ethnographic relationships. And for Dr. Green, that includes personal relationships spanning decades. We also invited participants to invite others into the study, which many of them did. Now, most of our sample identified as Black, though we did have participants who identified as white, Indigenous, and Asian. Interviews lasted between 20 minutes to 3 hours. All interviews were recorded, transcribed, and underwent several rounds of coding. Participants were all compensated $30 for their time. Now, all the names and nicknames that I used during today's presentation are pseudonyms. And of course, this is done to protect participants' identity and to protect anonymity. I'm also going to be using direct quotes, many of which have some foul language, but it's because I really want to center and amplify our participants' voices. Now, another thing that's important to mention, and that is really critical to emphasize, is that the vast majority of residents in Regent Park and St. Jamestown are law-abiding citizens. However, our particular participant pool was heavily involved in the informal economy. Almost all had some type of criminal involvement, either at present or in the past. And all of our participants reported frequent and ongoing police contact, which usually commenced at the age of 12. And so this is a particular subgroup of these neighborhoods, right? Not representative of everyone. And this particular subgroup has been quite heavily criminalized for many years. Jeff, can you hit the slide, please? Thank you. Now, of course, it's important when we're considering our participants' experiences and perceptions of police to highlight the context and the milieu in which these occur. So our participants' experiences were heavily dictated and largely painted by precisely the neighborhoods that they came from and where they lived. The first neighborhood, the first field site here is Regent Park. Now, Regent Park is located just east of Toronto's downtown core. It's Canada's oldest and one of the largest social housing projects. Though the neighborhood is presently being revitalized, up until not too long ago, all 100% of the neighborhood's 69 acres were devoted to social housing. Now, despite its revitalization, the poverty rate still doubles the city's average, so does the proportion of low-income residents. We also know that 60% of children who are under 17 and 40% of residents between 18 and 64, lived in poverty. Additionally, 70% of residents identify as being visible minorities, with a high proportion of those identifying as Black. Next slide, please. A few blocks north of Regent Park is St. Jamestown. It's home to approximately 18,000 residents and is the most densely populated neighborhood in all of Canada. St. Jamestown is a mix of corporate-owned and government-subsidized rental properties, but it's most widely known probably for its really remarkable high-rise apartment buildings. We know 40% of residents live at or below the poverty line, and almost 67% of community members identify as being members of visible minorities, and about half or so report being immigrants. Now, both Regent Park and St. Jamestown have been highly stigmatized for decades. They are known to be spaces of concentrated and racialized poverty, and as such bring really significant challenges to the many residents that live there. Large portions of these neighborhoods are also Toronto community housing projects, which is, of course relates to social housing, and this carries its own unique stigma. In relation to that, both of these neighborhoods have had really strained relationships with police for decades, which is some of my previous work talks about in greater depth. Can you hit the slide, please? Thank you. So what we're going to talk about today is our data through this paper, which demonstrates that police community relations in the inner city in Toronto are more complex than existing empirical work conveys. We know that officer homogenization in assessments of residents' views can miss really critical differences in how individuals perceive and navigate policing in these really vulnerable kind of areas. For our participants in our study, the first question in regards to the police was always, are the cops coming? But the second and arguably more important question was, which cops? Now, this follow-up, right, the second question was critical to how participants responded to police presence. So what this shows us is that some inner city residents do not uniformly view the police or respond the same way to police in their neighborhoods, as existing literature has really pushed. But instead, they actively engage in a process that we refer to as cop clocking, where they differentiate between police officers and use this differentiation to respond in quite different, nuanced, and discernible ways. So let's get to it. Jeff, can you hit the slide, please? Thank you. So in Regent Park in St. Jamestown, one of the things that came up quite frequently during data collection was the existence of these several officers who had these really near mythical urban legend type reputations. These reputations, according to our participants, branded these officers as quite distinct from the other police officers that were always patrolling the neighborhoods. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into too much detail here. The stories and the histories of these nicknames are outlined quite extensively in our paper, but I do want to give you a little bit of an overview. So one of the things that's really important to emphasize is that these police officers were quite notorious in these neighborhoods. And this notoriety was based on their alleged involvement in police corruption. Residents gave them these interesting nicknames, such as Squirrel, Gunner, Terminator, and Stomps. And narratives about these officers were a staple of the neighborhoods. Now, some of the misconduct that the officers were allegedly involved in was quite ranging, but included things such as planting evidence, preying on residents from treetops, forcing drug dealers to consume their own product, use of unnecessary violence and force, and stealing and robbing from residents. Now, these reputations, as I'm going to show throughout the talk, have really important inflections and implications for our participants. Slide, please. Thanks. Now, if you've read some of the accounts of these officers and how they got these reputations and the behaviors that they're known for, you have to admit some of these accounts are quite surprising. And yet these stories and these reputations were quite widely shared across the neighborhood. So when we asked Dex and Sully how they first heard about these officers, we see Dex describing learning about them through the streets. Sully goes further, right? Sully says, because legend, if they do it to one guy, he tells somebody, someone tells someone else. Before you know it, it goes around quick. It's like the wind. And then you hear Squirrel is out or Terminator is out. And these guys are out beating people up and breaking guys' arms and stuff. So according to Dex and Sully, we see this vicarious learning and the transmission of these narratives through other residents, which is quite consistent with some of the policing literature to date. Next slide, please. Now, I want to highlight that despite already not really having the greatest views and perceptions of police and having already amassed, quite a wide range of negative interactions with police officers, our participants were still careful about just blindly accepting the quote unquote truth of every story, right? They acknowledged that based on some of these allegedly preposterous instances, that these stories might be perhaps slightly exaggerated or even entirely fabricated. But they were really careful to contextualize this for us. So here, Dino says, I've been hearing stories about this guy, Gunner, always robbing people. I was skeptical. Many people were saying this and I just didn't believe it until it happened to me. And then I was like, wow, that really does happen, and these guys are capable of anything. Now, according to Dino, his own interactions with these officers confirmed the narratives that he had heard in the neighborhood and didn't fully believe, despite knowing that police in Regent Park can behave in ways that residents don't appreciate or that residents believe are unlawful. Similarly, while Lincoln told us that he first heard about Gunner's alleged corruption through the streets, he was really quick to clarify that he eventually had his own direct experiences with Gunner, claiming that I witnessed it myself and it's real. Next slide, please. Now, what we see is that our participants first acted upon these narratives by drawing upon them to guide their behaviors. And second, there was also this expectation that participants reproduced and shared these stories. Participants understood the necessity of widely spreading these accounts across Regent Park and St. Jamestown. They insisted that interacting with Squirrel, Gunner, Stomps, or Terminator could be particularly consequential over and beyond interacting with other officers. Because of this, they were motivated to try to limit their own and others' opportunities for running into these cops and having to deal with them. So here, Sully's telling me, he says, in order to avoid that, you say, you know what, prevention is always better than the cure. I don't want to go to the hospital and fix my broken arm. I'd rather not have a broken arm, so we try not to be around when they're around. Here I clarify whether they just watch to see if they're on their shift, and Sully says yes. And luckily, you're not the unfortunate soul who got caught first, and you're the one who has to tell people when they're around. Luckily, I was the guy that heard. I was never the guy that had to tell. Next slide, please. Now, apart from the possibility of being assaulted or having evidence planted on you, our participants were also pretty concerned about the latent collateral consequences of encountering these infamous officers. So according to what participants told us, participants had additional and arguably more serious reasons to avoid running into these officers. So Dino one night was telling me about a recent situation where he was on the way to the beer store with his girlfriend. He allegedly ran into Gunner, who allegedly searched him right there on the street, found his cocaine, took his cocaine, and also took his money. Now, Dino explained what happened next. He says, he took my phone, and because I would not tell him what he wanted to know, he said these exact words. All right, you don't want to tell us what you know? We're going to make you look like a rat. We're going to take everyone on your phone and call them and say you're going to set them up. I took that very seriously. I was disturbed, highly disturbed by what they said, like, I'm going to make you look like a rat. Oh my God, you're trying to get me killed. Now, in neighborhoods like Regent Park and St. Jamestown, being referred to as or having a reputation as a rat is, of course, a death warrant, right? It's not something that's looked upon very highly. Now, what's quite troubling is that according to Dino, Gunner and his colleague followed through, and they were actually calling and texting his contacts. Now, this forced Dino to rush to the nearest cell phone store to try to cancel his phone line. If this instance occurred, it's quite troubling to consider what may have happened if Dino wasn't able to counteract these efforts in time. Next slide. Now, participants also spoke of other serious collateral consequences that could result from interactions with this particular group of officers. So when recounting a time when Gunner and a comrade allegedly stole drugs, Lake told me that these officers start problems for the men in Regent Park and St. Jamestown. When I asked him to clarify, he explained, so if I go and pull off your lock and come in your house and take your dope and then leave, if I just call my buddy, like, yo, the cops came and took my dope, he's like, okay, well, you still have to pay me. You owe me $6,000. Well, then you have to rob someone, basically. Or else they come to your yard like, bang. Like, a lot of people get shot over those things. There's a circle. The cops are just as criminal, even more criminal, probably. Now, in neighborhoods like Regent Park and St. Jamestown, where gun violence is an unfortunate lived reality for many residents, and particularly for young Black men, such concerns are both real and pressing. So as we see, residents believe that interactions with these officers can jam them and can generate a chain reaction, which can induce additional problems that may lead to fatalities. Because of this, inner city residents work hard to equip themselves and others with this knowledge and to try to cultivate strategies to stay safe. So when Lake refers to these police behaviors as operating within a circle, he's really attuning us to how police misconduct may propel the cycle of victimization in the streets. This is something that I hope scholars examine in greater depth in the future. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, I really want to contextualize that most of our participants certainly did not necessarily like the police or welcome interactions with them. And almost all of them would prefer to generally avoid that contact. However, not all officers were considered equal in the inner city. Consider what Orion said. He says, each cop has their own MO, what they like to do to people. Now, because of these different MOs, right, encountering Squirrel, Gunner, Stomps, or Terminator could be far worse than encountering other officers. Jameson clarifies this, right? Says, I know certain cops are goofs and certain cops you could talk to. And then you get 4 of them that are goofs, and that's when they rob you. Do you know what I mean? So our participants were adamant that this group of notorious officers was different from the rest, and you couldn't necessarily paint police with this massively broad brush when it comes to running into them on the streets. For greater context, see this joint interview with Ty and Chantel. Next slide, please. So here we have an exchange between Ty and Chantel. So Ty, is saying these cops, not all cops, but there's a certain group of cops that have their own vendetta and they do their own thing every day. Then Chantel jumps in and she says, and Stomps, he takes it personally. He's here on his off time. I know when he's not on the clock, he's still here. And Ty confirms it. He says, yeah, off time. Stomps, fucking Squirrel, Terminator, those guys, those cops that do their vendetta, they just do their own thing. Those are the crooked ones. Next slide, please. Now, because officers allegedly behave so differently, our participants crafted officer-specific strategies where they modified their behaviors to mitigate any dangers posed by these notorious officers. So see what Solly explains. He says, when you hear certain police patrolling the neighborhood, it would be a ghost town that day because everybody would know what he is up to. So everyone would find somewhere far to go, like out of the division. Now, if you've ever been to Regent Park or St. Jamestown, you know that on most days, these neighborhoods are absolutely bustling, usually filled with residents hanging out outside, having barbecues, spending time with friends and family. But you'll also know that police presence is not unique. It's quite common. Police routinely patrol on foot, in cars, on bicycles, sometimes even on horseback. And because of this, participants often encounter police many times a day. So police presence is not unusual. And because of how common it is in the neighborhood, it doesn't usually leave residents running inside and hiding from police generally. This may happen for, a subset who are on warrants or who have conditions, but generally our participants don't necessarily run inside and hide when they see a police car drive by. However, from our findings, we see that the presence or rumored presence of specific officers could clear out the neighborhoods. So see this exchange. Next slide, please. So here, Nathan tells me what happens when Gunner is spotted in the neighborhood. He says, everyone's like, oh my God, that's Gunner, this and that. Some people disappear. People will go around the corner, come back. No one wants to play with him. Sully describes his own tailored response. He says, if I knew Squirrel was around, luckily I was dating a girl that lived elsewhere. So I would just go to her house and stay there for a couple of days because they usually patrol for 3 to 4 days and then you don't see them for 2 weeks. So, when they're around, you're taking a vacation or you can take your chances. Sully apparently didn't like the chances, so he always took the vacation. Next slide. What's more telling is that here we have Nathan, who compares this group of notorious officers to others. He says, when you hear like Terminator's coming, when you hear these names, it's time to leave. Whereas if there's a patrol car passing, just looking, you keep it moving. But when you hear, yo, Terminator's outside, you know that guy's coming. There's going to be a problem. So it's best to just leave once you hear that name. Now, these stringent methods of avoiding them did not just apply to the police generally, right? But again, to this small handful of officers. I really want to emphasize two more important points. First, strict avoidance was not the only officer-specific strategy that our participants in Regent Park and St. Jamestown used. And second, our data indicate that participants also differentiated between notorious officers. What do I mean by that? Well, responses to notorious officers varied. Consider Dex's point here. Next slide, please. If you hear Terminator come for you, you might as well turn yourself in, or else he catches you in these buildings, he's giving you the business. Since participants believe Terminator to be particularly relentless over and above the other notorious officers, some of them said that, or believed that efforts to evade him and run from him would be quite futile and could result in additional harms. So perhaps instead of strictly trying to run from him like they might with Squirrel, Gunner, or Stomps, in this case, Dex recommends just giving in to his efforts. Next slide. Now, this process of differentiating between police officers is again what we've coined as cop clocking. How did this term come about? Well, if you're familiar with Toronto slang, you know that clocking refers to observing people in situations of interest, right? And trying to learn from what you see happening. In this case, cop clocking then refers to residents' ongoing surveillance of specific police officers within the neighborhood, and the process through which this knowledge is gathered, shared, and acted upon. As I've kind of highlighted today, cop clocking is an important neighborhood safety strategy, which residents use to both anticipate and mitigate the risks of interacting with specific police officers. Now, of course, the presence of any officers was usually enough reason for most of our participants to be a bit vigilant, right? Be on their P's and Q's, look around, see what's happening. But the presence or rumored presence of certain cops really produced this hypervigilance in them. And this produced really distinct responses. This is the information they used to determine whether they would stay put or whether they would leave the neighborhood or go inside. In our paper, we also flesh out that cop clocking can extend beyond notorious police officers and can inform how participants interact with officers that are generally less intimidating or perhaps who are just better police. Nevertheless, through cop clocking, what we do is we really extend Stewart's concept of cop wisdom. Cop clocking really helps to further unveil and unmask the really complex and nuanced nature of police-community relations, and particularly how residents in inner city neighborhoods might navigate running into police many times a day. Now, of course, scholars and police officials often disagree on the nature and pervasiveness of police misconduct. As we see, this can frequently play out in the bad apples or the bad barrels debate. Next slide, please. However, I do really want to highlight that based on our data, it appears that the prevalence of police misconduct may not be all that relevant for how inner city residents view police generally. What we see, perhaps unsurprisingly, is that the actions of a small number of officers contribute to perceptions of police as a whole. So this is what Ty told us one night. He says, some cops, I guess you could say that they're okay. But just like they say, I'm guilty by association because of my crowd of people, they're guilty of association. Because if I'm not doing nothing wrong and your fellow officers are mistreating me and you can't voice up and say nothing to your fellow officers, then you're just as guilty as them. So what we see here is that officer complacency and misconduct may impact perceptions of police as a whole. Next slide. Perfect. Now, there's a couple of things that are important that I want to say before we end. First, despite the prevalence of these stories, we know that interactions with these 4 infamous officers represent a small proportion of the interactions with police in Regent Park and St. Jamestown. Despite that, as we see, they can be highly consequential for how residents navigate the neighborhoods and interact with police officers. Second, in the paper, we thoroughly discuss questions surrounding the truth of these accounts. We recognize that those who might be unfamiliar with policing in Regent Park and St. Jamestown, or policing of other highly marginalized and racialized communities, might dismiss these accounts as fabricated. While we discuss that in greater depth in the paper, I do want to highlight how the environ of the inner city, combined with our participants' positionality, right, being racial and ethnic minorities and economically disadvantaged, in addition to highly discretionary and low visibility officer decision-making, might contribute and create this environment where such instances of police misconduct are possible, and where police abuses might either go unseen or unchecked by other officers. So in an era where we have police services across North America, really struggling with this crisis of police legitimacy and attempting to build trust with inner city neighborhoods and racialized communities, calling out these behaviors when they happen and rejecting complicity in misconduct, publicly acknowledging and taking responsibility for these behaviors in the past and the present is critical to these efforts. Thank you. Perfect.
All right. So any questions for Marta? You can just turn your microphone on if you're in the Zoom, or type it into the chat on Zoom or on YouTube for our 20 or so YouTube viewers.
Should I go?
Go for it, Kevin.
Okay, thanks, Marta. That was interesting. As you were talking, I was thinking about the parallels with some of the prison research that we've done, where a lot of incarcerated folks do roughly the same type of thing, that they individualize kind of problems and notorious officers inside the institutions. But I guess what I was interested in is where you ended up on with the rotten apple, rotten barrel kind of thing. And one of the criticisms of the whole thinking about officers as kind of rotten apples is it kind of forecloses thinking about more structural or institutional problems. Did the men and women you spoke with, did they also think more organizationally or institutionally, or was this almost uniformly about bad people?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and it's one that I've definitely grappled with. So when it comes to these notorious officers, it was very individualized, right? We have specific problems, and so when these cops show up in the neighborhood, that's when we leave because of their reputations, as compared to the friendly officer that rides by on their bicycle. But they did generally, and perhaps unsurprisingly, have issues with the institution of policing. A lot of these issues really come out in some of my other work, specifically the paper with Carolyn Green looking at misconduct during police raids, where residents shift their focus from individual officers and just see police come in as a unified force, raid their homes, and allegedly engage in different types of misconduct in those kind of issues. So they see huge issues and they recognize and they claim that the institution of policing, particularly as it plays out in their neighborhood, is based on often racist and classist values, but they really are capable also of individuating kind of between police officers as well.
So I've got a couple of questions from YouTube here. So the first one from L'Oreal. She says, interesting research, Marta. What do you think citizens' differentiation regarding specific police officers have been why do you think citizens' differentiation regarding specific police officers have been relatively unexplored in the policing literature? And maybe I'll let you take that one. Then she's got a couple of follow-up questions after that.
Excellent. You know, that's a really good question. And I think scholars should consider that more in depth. I mean, of course, you know, I hope that this paper's emphasis on individual officers and, you know, the not all cops perspective doesn't detract from really necessary, critical, and timely concerns and criticisms about policing as a whole, right? So I do want to kind of preface that. I think scholars have a tendency to perhaps step away from these individualized processes and look at the whole just because it's quite simple to do that. And because looking at the individual processes really requires careful consideration. And I think we can do both. I think we can criticize the broader institution while acknowledging that some police officers do not participate necessarily in this system as extensively as kind of others do. So I think that's kind of where I would go with that.
Okay, and she also asks, how do you think the on-the-ground experiences of notorious police officers in inner-city neighborhoods can be understood within the context of police violence and structural racism in police forces?
Yeah, so that's, again, a really fascinating question. I think, and, you know, on the last slide, I really tried to emphasize this, that it's the broader context and the broader population that I believe enables these instances to occur. I imagine, and I'm sure my co-authors agree, that these type of behaviors would not be as prevalent or as common in other types of neighborhoods, which are not as racialized or which are more, you know, financially prosperous. And this is consistent with the other literature. So in a broader system where unfortunately, you know, highly discretionary, low visibility, and this chronic reputation of unfortunately over-policing, over-surveying, and abusing inner city residents, that really propels this existence. One interesting thing, and I do want to explore this more in future work, is that some of our participants were hopeful to some extent that, you know, with phones and with greater cameras and with this greater push for police accountability and transparency, that this might change things in their favor a little bit, but they were still really cautious about the extent to which this can help.
Okay, and great. And a second question from Adam here. He's wondering. He says he was a little bit late to the talk, and he's wondering whether this research was conducted pre or post George Floyd.
Yes, so this research started pre George Floyd. It started in 2016. We did do some follow-up interviews earlier last year, or following George Floyd last year, but the data has been pretty consistent.
Any other questions for Marta here?
Hi, Marta. It's Shelley Takis calling. I'm just curious, have you approached the law enforcement with this information? Like, have you seen any kind of movement to address this on a more large division scale or individually with the officers? Have you gotten any kind of traction there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So right now, the study is ongoing. The plan is definitely to try to incorporate and seek out police perspectives later on. The reason that we haven't kind of done it at the same time as gathering resident perceptions is, of course, you know, concerns of appearing to be potentially a police informant or working with police, given what our participants are involved in. So the plan is definitely to bring this forward to police services. Some of our other work highlighting perceptions and experiences of police misconduct during police raids was definitely brought to the media's attention, which brought it to the attention of law enforcement officials. And there was, you know, the standard official statement of we follow all the rules and procedures when it comes to police raids. So odds are this doesn't happen. And we assume that that's probably what we're going to get, but I think it's important. And I think I would like to really encourage, if police officers see this or hear these stories, that they are honest and forthcoming with researchers about how this might affect, you know, working within the police service and how this might damage their relationships with community members kind of more broadly. But for this stage of the project, we really wanted to center and amplify the experiences of community members.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Shelley.
So I have another question from YouTube here. Adam kind of follow up to his last question, asking why why do you think police forces fail to acknowledge the existence of these types of officers?
Yeah, that's obviously a great question. I mean, the PR is of course not great, right? And we know, and this is similar to what the literature has done, is that perceptions of police are, of course, police are often painted with a broad brush. And we know that these perceptions and views of police are also exported not just within our own neighborhoods, but between what's happening in other countries, right? There's this general, if a police officer in one jurisdiction did this, then, they might all be involved in this. And to some way that is consistent because of course, the institution of policing and, what it is built on. But at the same time, police services are trying to, I believe, move past this, and I believe they're trying to repair their relationships with community members. The extent to which, they are actively doing that or doing that with well-intentioned or with good intentions, I'm not going to comment on that, but we can see the challenges of calling that out. We also know that there is this culture of, silence and protecting one's own. And so I think it's difficult, certainly for individual officers to report fellow officers who might engage with this, which my other paper actually looking at police misconduct during raids talks about how our own participants acknowledge how difficult it is for police officers who witness corruption but don't participate in it to report on other officers. And so we kind of see multiple things going on here, right? Generally, the structure and institution of policing, that's a cause, police culture more broadly, and then of course the expectation that officers protect their own. And liability issues, I must add as well.
Awesome. Okay, another question here, this time from Rowan. Did your research show any ways this affected day-to-day life in the communities?
Yeah, so I mean, for our participants, of course, this can affect day-to-day life, as some of them mentioned. When these specific officers were out and about, sometimes participants would have to leave or stay indoors for days at a time. Going further in the future with the study, we'd like to see whether this also applied to other residents as well. However, our broader study has acknowledged and is looking at precisely how experiences of policing further shape how residents navigate kind of communities generally.
Okay, so I think time is kind of winding down here. If maybe we could take one more question if anybody has one other one. Otherwise, we'll end the kind of live stream and people can hang out. But if there's maybe one last question, we can take that. Otherwise, we'll kind of call it a day. Going once. Okay, I think, if there's no other questions, then I will end the live stream and Marta and the people here can just hang out and chat, while you're not being recorded, apart from the Google surveillance state. But thanks everybody for coming out, and thanks to everybody who joined us on YouTube. And thanks of course to Marta for a really great talk. And we hope to see you again on February 26th, same time, for our talk from Dr.